Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with my spoiler-free review of Godmersham Park by Gill Hornby. At this time that this video is going up, this book is coming out in, I think, just a few days. I think November 1st is the release date. And as I said, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. I received this copy in exchange for an honest review. I'm also going to list content notes in the description box, so please check that out if you would like to. But this is a historical fiction book that is based on like true stories or around true people. We are following Anne Sharp, who was the governess of one of the Austen members' family. So basically, you know, Jane Austen, of course, and then she had like all of her brothers and sisters, and so we are following the governess of the family of one of her brothers, if that makes sense. And this is, as I said, based on a true story, based on real people. The author has a note at the beginning and the end talking briefly about all of the information that we do have and what she had to extrapolate, but a lot of, like, all of the events, the things that actually happen in this book, we have records of, like, we know they did happen because the young girl who Anne Sharp was the governess for kept a diary or journal that, like, covered everything that happened. So as I said, Anne Sharp is our main character. She's the governess for this family, and we find out a lot more about her backstory as we go. I like that we start things off and she's already getting the position with the Austen family, Edward Austen specifically, his family, and we kind of hear more about her life and what has brought her to this point, because pretty much, like, I actually really liked the way this book looked at being a governess in this time period, and how like 95% of the time the reason women became governesses is because they were failed by the men in their lives, whether that was husbands, fathers, brothers. Basically they didn't have like the men in their lives who knew that they were the only thing kind of like taking care of these women, and then just didn't do that. So I really liked that focus throughout the book, and like almost the entirety of this book we really spend with Anne and this family as she's trying to find her place there. We hear a lot about the very difficult position that a governess was in, because she wasn't really one of the servants. Like, she was a little bit higher than them, but she definitely wasn't part of the family either. So she kind of was in this no man's land where she didn't really feel like she could relate to anybody. She didn't have a lot of friends. But we do see, like, it's not a really sad book overall, which I appreciated. I like that the tone could be so light and clever. And then this is kind of, funnily enough, another book where I feel like the synopsis is just slightly misleading. And again, this is not like the author's fault or anything, because the authors usually don't write their own synopses, but it's talking about how when Mr. Edward Austen's family comes to stay, Anne forms an immediate attachment to Jane, obviously Jane Austen. They write plays together and enjoy long discussions. However, in the process, Anne reveals herself as not merely pretty, charming, and competent. She is clever too. Even her sleepy, complacent mistress can hardly fail to notice. Meanwhile, Jane's brother Henry begins to take an unusually strong interest in the lovely young governess. From now on, Anne's days at Godmersham Park are numbered. And like, technically, yes, I think that is true, but that's really not what this book is about. Like, I feel like that description makes it sound like the majority of this book, or like the main point of this book, is going to be this like forbidden attraction between Anne and like one of the like wealthy young men of the family, and that's not really the case. I also like that this book does look at the potential for some of these characters to have a romantic interest in each other, like between women specifically, and the way that like sapphic relationships would have been written about in a way that makes it hard to figure out as like a modern historian, like exactly what was going on there. I thought that was handled pretty well, although that's another thing that the synopsis doesn't really talk about. So I've kind of started getting into the review section already, so let me just do that. As I was saying, I really enjoyed the writing style. I found it very engaging and clever and interesting. I found this book a really compelling and quick read, even though it is quite slow and character focused. Definitely don't pick this book up for the plot. I think that this is really for readers who like character studies, who are interested in this time period, who are interested in this specific kind of story about a kind of tangential figure in Jane Austen's life, because Jane Austen is in this book, but she is by no means like the center of this book. So yeah, I really enjoyed the writing. I think the historical details were done really well. As I said, we get a lot of this we actually know happened, and then the author is kind of extrapolating from that. And I thought the balance of what we know and then what she kind of invented for her story, I think that balance was pretty good. And I really liked hearing about kind of how she like made these decisions, how she interpreted things. And then as far as the characters, this was a really interesting book for me. I'll tell you right now that I gave Godmersham Park 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. But it's kind of funny because Anne, as a protagonist, I didn't love necessarily. Like, I really felt for her, and I thought she was interesting and I wanted to see how things would turn out with her. Like, I found her a very compelling main character and I found the book very compelling. But Anne as a character, I had kind of mixed feelings on. Some of that I think is because of the way that she felt very judgmental about kind of like other women and the way other women would behave. And I think some of that is called out by the story. And one thing I did really like is that the writing of those sections, I feel like, is meant to show the reader that we shouldn't agree with that. Like, Anne felt this way, but that's not okay, you know? But I do wish that the story itself would have done a little bit more to challenge that, because, especially because Anne herself is a woman who's having to kind of do the best she can. It was a little frustrating that she didn't realize that sometimes other women were doing that as well and just making different choices than her. As I said, I also really like the way that through Anne we get a look at what being a governess could have been like. And in a lot of ways this is a very good family situation, but still it's not an easy thing to do. It wasn't an easy position in life or class at this time. And then I also think Anne is an interesting character because it felt like a lot of her growth or characterization was kind of like plot determined. I think a lot of Anne's characterization was determined by her backstory or by kind of like the plot beats that were happening, and I would have liked to get a little bit more feel for her as like a fully rounded person. But even with all of that, as I was saying, I did still care about her. I did still find her engrossing. I found this book very compelling. As I said, I read it very quickly. I also like that the chapters are fairly short. I also enjoyed the characterization of Jane herself. Like, you know, always fun to have Jane Austen as a character, and I like the way that Gill Hornby wrote her here. And then I also think Henry Austen was very interesting as a character. I think he's clearly supposed to be a conflicting character, and I like the way that that was done. As far as some of the other side characters, I feel like they were kind of inconsistent in the way that they were portrayed. They also sort of felt like it was determined by what the plot demanded, or just like some of the transitions I think felt a little odd. Like, we would suddenly hear about like something that has been happening to Anne for a while, and like we didn't know about that before, which I can understand that that's also just a storytelling decision. But then there were things where like something would happen with like one of the other servants or one of the other side characters, and we were told how Anne felt about this person, and that didn't seem to be at all reflected in like her behavior or in the way the other parts of the story were written. So I had kind of mixed feelings about how the side characters were used. I just would have liked more consistency from them. And then also, this is kind of a plot and character thing. I found it a little weird that like the author used italics so much, and in a very, very specific way. So there are 4 different female characters who use probably at least 3 or 4 italics every time they speak, like every like section of dialogue that they have, and like that just felt very strange, like really repetitive. I don't understand that as like a writing choice. I don't know why like an editor didn't like take that out or change that, because it was 4 different characters and it made them all sound the same too, because not only are you like forcing a certain kind of tone into the dialogue, but like it was very repetitive and it made all of these women sound very much the same. Like, it was with Jane, it was with Harriet, it was with Fanny, who's the young girl that Anne is the governess for, and then I think it was maybe with Mrs. Austen, so like the lady of the house. I can't remember if she was the other one, but 4 different characters, and like one I think would have been, you know, like a character quirk and that would have been fine. 2 is like a little weird, but to get up to 4 people who do that, I personally found that very distracting as I was reading their dialogue. And Anne sometimes used italics in her dialogue, but only like a couple times as compared to like every single time she spoke. So I don't know, I just found that a very odd choice. I didn't really care for that. It didn't like ruin the reading experience for me by any means, and as I was saying, I did really enjoy the writing overall, but I just wanted to mention that because I found that very odd. I don't know why that was a choice that happened here. And then as for the plot, I was pretty much talking about this already, but despite the kind of misleading synopsis, I did find this a really compelling story. I was just very caught up in these details of these characters' lives and wanting to know what was going to happen to all of them. So I found the story itself very interesting. And then also, as far as the concept of this book, like telling a historically based story about this woman, Anne Sharp, who the reason I think that she is a little more known now is because of a copy of Emma that was auctioned off recently. The author talks about this in the back, and like the dedication or like the inscription to Anne, and like how that led us to learn more about this very close friend of Jane Austen's, and all of that I found very interesting. I think that this book is a very successful execution of that concept. As I said, I think the the balance of the historical facts and then like the creative license, I think that was very good. I do think that like sometimes it felt a little bit like Jane Austen herself was a little bit overshadowed by Anne. I think that's kind of natural though when you're telling a story with like the main character not being the famous person. I can see why as an author you would kind of like highlight your main character sometimes to the detriment of the other one, but it was just a little funny or weird because like there were times, like for example, like Jane Austen at one point kind of like chastised Anne for like showing that she was too clever or something, and like it was supposed to be because, you know, women were not supposed to be too clever and all of that, and I understand like, you know, wanting to write within the confines of society and everything, but it felt very funny to me that like Jane Austen was telling another woman writer like to pull back on the cleverness, you know? I mean, I guess like Jane Austen's books are very sneaky clever sometimes, but I just felt like that exchange felt a little bit heavy-handed, like we were just trying to like really like punch up how clever and brilliant and interesting Anne Sharp is, and it's like, okay, but so is Jane Austen, you know? And then finally, I really did enjoy and appreciate how the themes were shown in this book. As I was saying, there's a lot about class, there's a lot about gender and the way that women had very limited options and the way that they were sometimes forced into options because of the men in their lives. I just found that very poignant, very effective. And as I said, I did really like that this book shows the possibility of some romantic love between women and how we might be able to interpret that based on historical sources and everything. Again, I do wish that that had been a little more clear from the synopsis because that shouldn't really be a spoiler, but it does kind of make sense because the characters are sort of just figuring out that this is how they feel. So yeah, as a whole, I really enjoyed this. This is definitely not going to be a book for everyone. As I said, it's very, very character focused, but if this concept interests you, I think it is very well written. I think the historical aspects are done very well. I found it, as I've said multiple times, very compelling and interesting, and like the writing just flowed so nicely that I read this very quickly. It reminded me a tiny bit of The Heiress by Molly Greeley, and also a little bit of Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, like with the governess focus and with some of the themes. And then The Heiress is also a historical book that I think that one has like a stronger kind of character transformation, but that one also kind of talks about love between women in a historical period. So Godmersham Park is definitely its own book as well, but there are some elements that are kind of similar to those other books. So those might be like, if you liked those, maybe you would want to try this one as well. But as I said, I gave Godmersham Park 4 stars. Let me know if you are planning to pick this one up or if you've already read it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!